In the desert of New Mexico, there are human footprints that are 23,000 years old. Not hundreds, not thousands, 23,000 years. An adult, a child, and at one point, the smaller prints disappear. Not because the child stopped walking, because someone picked them up. A person carrying a child across wet ground in the middle of the Ice Age, on a continent that scientists spent decades insisting was empty. Long before Columbus, long before Rome fell, long before the first pyramid was built anywhere on Earth, someone was here. Who were they? How did they get here? And why did it take us this long to admit that everything we thought we knew about the first Americans was incomplete? A set of bones and a question nobody wanted to answer. On the afternoon of July 28th, 1996, two college students were standing on the bank of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, watching a boat race. The water was low that summer, lower than usual, and in the shallow mud at the edge of the river, one of them felt his foot catch on something that was not a rock and not a root. He looked down, a human skull, nearly complete, dark brown from thousands of years of minerals soaking into bone, sitting in the mud of an American river on an ordinary summer afternoon, waiting for someone to find it. They called the police. The police called the coroner. The coroner called an archaeologist named James Chatters, who drove out that evening and began to understand, piece by piece, that what had been found in the mud of the Columbia River was not recent. The bones were approximately 9,000 years old. What happened next became one of the most revealing stories in the history of American science, not because of what the bones told us about the past, because of what the fight over those bones told us about ourselves. The federal government moved to transfer the remains to the tribal nations of the Columbia Plateau. They called the ancient man the Ancient One and identified him as an ancestor. 8 archaeologists sued the government to stop the transfer. The lawsuit worked. For 10 years, the Ancient One sat in a climate-controlled storage facility at the University of Washington while lawyers argued and scientists waited, and the tribal nations watched a court system decide whether their ancestor was their ancestor. The legal dispute stretched across nearly 2 decades. And then DNA technology became precise enough to settle what 10 years of litigation could not. We will return to what that result was and what it meant later in this story. For now, what matters is the door that Kennewick opened, because the real question was never about one set of bones in one river. The real question was older and stranger than any legal dispute. Who were the first people to set foot on this continent? When did they arrive? How did they get here? And how much of what we confidently believed for most of the 20th century turned out to be wrong? The short answer is more than anyone expected. The longer answer is what follows. Chapter 1. The World Before America. To understand who the first Americans were, you need to understand the world they were moving through. Not the world as it appears in textbook diagrams, the world as it actually existed. A planet that looked almost nothing like the one we inhabit today. Start with the ocean, 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. The Earth was in the last glacial maximum. The great ice sheets covering the northern hemisphere had locked up so much of the planet's water that global sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today. Read that again. 300 to 400 feet. What that means in practice is this. The shallow continental shelves that today lie beneath the ocean were then exposed as dry land. The Pacific coast of North America extended miles further west than it does now. The Bering Sea, which today separates Alaska from Russia by about 55 miles of open water, did not exist. In its place was a landmass that geologists call Beringia, And Beringia was not a land bridge in the way that phrase is usually imagined. It was not a narrow corridor of muddy ground connecting two larger places. It was a subcontinent, nearly 1,000 miles wide from north to south, larger than Alaska, with its own river systems, its own lakes, its own grasslands, and its own ecosystems that had been developing for tens of thousands of years. A person standing in the middle of Beringia would not have known they were standing on a bridge between two worlds. They would have been standing at home. Now look at where human beings were in this world. Homo sapiens had left Africa at least 70,000 years before this story begins. By 30,000 years ago, our species had reached Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia. The crossing to Australia is worth holding in mind. It required open water navigation. There was no land bridge. Getting there meant building watercraft capable of crossing stretches of open ocean, and doing so successfully enough that a founding population survived. Human beings had accomplished this at least 50,000 years ago. They were not incapable of the movement that reaching the Americas would require, and yet the Americas remained empty of human beings. Or so the evidence long suggested. Why? Not because of a lack of ability. The question is opportunity and timing and the specific configuration of ice and coastline and available food that would have made the journey not merely possible but survivable. Those conditions were changing, and before we follow those changes, we need to understand what was waiting at the other end. The Americas of 30,000 years ago were full. Woolly mammoths ranged across the northern grasslands. Mastodons browsed in the forests and wetlands further south. Horses, the ancestors of the species that European colonizers would later reintroduce, grazed across the plains. American camels, giant ground sloths, some as large as modern elephants, short-faced bears, whose long legs made them fast enough to run down prey across open ground. None of these animals had ever seen a human being. A prey animal that has never been hunted by an intelligent, tool-using predator does not have the behavioral responses that allow it to survive contact with one. It does not flee at the right distance. It does not treat the sight or smell of something upright and slow-moving as a signal of danger. The first people to enter this continent would have found, in the early generations, that hunting was not difficult in the way that hunting had been difficult everywhere else they had ever lived. That fact will matter later. Chapter 2. Clovis and 50 Years of Certainty. In 1932, near the town of Clovis in eastern New Mexico, archaeologists excavating alongside the bones of extinct mammoths found stone spear points, distinctive in shape, fluted along the base in a way that required considerable skill to produce. Carbon dating eventually placed these tools at between 13,000 and 13,500 years old. Over the following decades, Clovis points turned up across North America, from Alaska to Florida, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic. Wherever archaeologists dug in the right layers, the distinctive fluted points appeared at roughly the same age every time. The model that emerged was clean and confident. It was called Clovis first. The argument went like this: around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets began to retreat, a corridor of ice-free land opened between the two major ice masses, running from Alaska southward into the interior of the continent. A population of people living in Beringia moved south through this corridor. They encountered a continent full of naive prey animals, spread rapidly, and within a few thousand years had populated both North and South America. Their tools, the Clovis points, are the signature of this founding population. It was an elegant story. It had geographic logic. It had a mechanism. And for 50 years, it was treated not quite as proven fact, but as the working assumption against which any alternative evidence had to be measured. That last part is important. Science is not a pure and frictionless process of following evidence wherever it leads. It is a human activity, conducted by human beings who have built careers on particular frameworks, who have trained students within those frameworks, and who have reviewed each other's work within professional communities that have their own norms about what counts as sufficiently proven to be taken seriously. The Clovis first model, once established, became the default. And defaults are not easy to overturn. Evidence supporting the consensus was evaluated by normal standards. Evidence challenging it was held to a higher standard. Not because of dishonesty, because that is how scientific communities protect themselves from noise. The problem is that it also, sometimes, protects them from signal. A man named Tom Dillehay learned this over 20 years. In 1976, Dillehay was teaching in southern Chile when a colleague mentioned a site along a small creek near the town of Puerto Montt. Local people had been finding large bones in the creek bank for years. Dillehay went to look. What he found, as he began careful excavation, was a site of human habitation. Hearths, wooden structures, food remains, animal bones with cut marks, the evidence of people living in a place, not passing through it. The radiocarbon dates place the site at 14,500 years old, 1,000 years older than Clovis. In the southern tip of South America, if human beings were already living at the far end of the continent, 1,000 years before the Clovis people appeared at the top of it, then the Clovis people could not have been the first. Dillehay submitted his findings. He presented at conferences. He invited other researchers to come and see the site themselves. For nearly 20 years, the mainstream response was skepticism that ranged from polite to hostile. This was not a conspiracy. What was happening was something more ordinary and more instructive. A community of researchers was protecting a model they had built their field around, applying a higher standard of proof to evidence that threatened it, and doing so without necessarily being aware that this was what they were doing. In 1997, a delegation of the most respected archaeologists in North America traveled to Monteverde to examine the site in person. They came as skeptics. They left as something else. The site was real. The dates were real. The evidence was real. Clovis first was not. For half a century, the most basic fact about human history in the Americas was treated as settled. It was not settled. It was assumed. The difference between a settled question and an assumed one is exactly this. A settled question has been tested against every available alternative. An assumed question has simply not been challenged hard enough yet. What else, in the story we tell about this continent, is assumed rather than settled? That is the question the rest of this story is built around. Chapter 3. The sites that broke everything. Monteverde was not the only problem. It was the most visible one. But even as the argument over Monteverde was being settled, other sites were accumulating in the scientific literature, each one representing a different kind of challenge to the idea that human presence in the Americas began at a single point and spread outward in a single direction. They did not all point to the same conclusion. What they shared was a quality of inconvenience. They existed in places, and at times, that the dominant model had not predicted and could not easily absorb. Understanding them requires understanding something about how archaeological evidence works and how it fails. A stone tool is durable. It survives conditions that destroy almost everything else. But a stone tool sitting in a layer of sediment, is only as old as the layer it sits in. And layers of sediment can be disturbed. Water moves things. Animals move things. Roots grow through things. This means that challenging Clovis first required not just finding old things, it required finding old things in contexts so well preserved, so clearly undisturbed, so confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence, that no reasonable objection could be sustained. Monteverde met that standard. The other sites had varying degrees of success. The first is in Pennsylvania. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter sits in a sandstone cliff above a small creek in the southwestern corner of the state. It was excavated beginning in 1973 by a researcher named James Adivasio. What he found were stone tools, fire-cracked rocks, and the remains of basketry. The deepest layers carbon dated to somewhere between 16,000 and 19,000 years ago. If those dates are correct, human beings were sheltering in Pennsylvania during the last glacial maximum, at a time when both major ice sheets should have made the region inaccessible from the north, at a time when, according to every version of Clovis first, there were no human beings anywhere in the Americas. The objection raised was contamination. The region has coal deposits. Ancient carbon from those deposits might have leached into the samples, making them appear artificially old. Adivasio argued back, sample by sample. For 30 years, the debate has not been fully resolved. Most researchers today accept that Meadowcroft represents a genuine pre-Clovis occupation. The exact age remains a matter of ongoing discussion. The second site is in Oregon, and the evidence it produced is almost impossible to argue with. Paisley Caves is a series of wave-cut caves above a dry lake bed in south-central Oregon. Beginning in 2002, a team led by Dennis Jenkins began systematic excavation. What they found in the deepest layers was not tools. It was coprolates, human feces, preserved by the dry conditions for more than 14,000 years. And within those coprolites, extractable ancient DNA, human DNA. The value of this evidence is precisely that it removes almost all interpretive steps. A stone tool requires you to argue it was made by a human, deposited where it was found, in undisturbed sediment. Human feces with human DNA requires you to argue almost nothing except that a human being was in that cave. The dates came back at 14,300 years, older than Clovis. Again, the third site is in Mexico, and it is the most contested of all. Chiquihuite Cave sits at nearly 9,000 feet in the mountains of Zacatecas. In 2020, a team led by Cyprian Ardelian published findings in the journal Nature within the cave, in sediment layers dated to between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago. They found what they interpreted as stone tools. If those dates and that interpretation are both correct, human beings were in central Mexico during the last glacial maximum, not crossing a land bridge, not moving through an ice-free corridor. Already there, the field's response was cautious. The core question was not about the dates. It was about whether the objects were actually stone tools. Distinguishing deliberately flaked stone from stone fractured by natural processes is not always straightforward. Some analysts looked at the Chiquihuite material and concluded it was human-made. Others were not convinced. That disagreement has not been resolved. Chiquihuite Cave remains a site where the evidence is real. The dates are real, and the interpretation of what the evidence means is genuinely contested among researchers who have examined it carefully. This is not a failure of science. This is science. What these sites share, along with Monteverde, is something the Clovis first model did not predict. Human presence in the Americas before 13,000 years ago, in multiple locations, through multiple independent lines of evidence, confirmed by multiple teams using multiple methods. The model is not just wrong in its timing, it is wrong in its structure. The story of how people came to the Americas is not a single founding population arriving at a single moment. It is something more complex, more contingent, and more interesting. But here is what none of these sites give us. They give us tools. They give us DNA. They give us fire-cracked rock and animal bone and the accumulated debris of human occupation. What none of them show us is a specific moment, a specific day, a specific human being in a specific place, doing a specific thing. That is what the next discovery changed. Chapter 4. White Sands and the Morning That Changed Everything. In September of 2021, the journal Science published a paper that did something unusual in a field accustomed to incremental progress and carefully hedged conclusions. It showed us a morning, not a tool, not a fragment of bone, not an ambiguous flake of stone whose status as a human artifact could be disputed by anyone with a working knowledge of natural fracture patterns. A morning, preserved in the sediment of an ancient lakebed in White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, waiting in the form of 61 human footprints. The footprints were found the way many significant things are found in science, by people paying close attention to something already visible. The surface of the dry lakebed at White Sands is crossed by countless impressions, some from animals, some ambiguous, some clearly human. A team that included researchers from the National Park Service, the United States Geological Survey, and several universities had been studying these impressions for years, before the full significance of what they were looking at became clear. 61 footprints, preserved in what had once been wet mud at the edge of a shallow lake, an adult moving across wet ground, at a pace that analysts could calculate from the spacing between steps, heading in a specific direction. And at one point in the trackway, the stride lengthens slightly. The depth of the impression at the heel increases. The gait shifts in a way that biomechanics researchers recognized immediately. The pattern of someone carrying additional weight. The child's footprints, which had been parallel to the adult's, disappear. Not because the child stopped, because someone picked them up and kept walking. Now hold that image, and hold what follows. The dating of these footprints was made possible by seeds. Seeds from an aquatic plant called Rupia cirrhosa that grew in the lake, and whose seeds were incorporated into the sediment at the level of the footprints. Seeds are ideal for radiocarbon dating. They are short-lived, incorporating carbon from the atmosphere at a specific moment in time. The dates that came back from multiple samples, taken from multiple locations within the footprint layer, were consistent, between 21,000 and 23,000 years before the present. A subsequent study using a completely different dating method, based on the decay of quartz grains exposed to sunlight before burial, produced dates consistent with the original results. The current state of the evidence is this. White Sands represents the strongest, most directly confirmed evidence of human presence in the Americas before 15,000 years ago. The weight of evidence, assessed by the majority of researchers who have examined it, points toward a genuine human presence in what is now New Mexico during the last glacial maximum. And that creates a problem that cannot be solved by adjusting dates slightly or revising details. It creates a geography problem, 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. The ice-free corridor between the two major ice sheets did not exist. The two great ice masses had not yet separated. There was no land route from Beringia to the interior of the continent. The corridor that the Clovis first model depended on would not open for another 8,000 to 10,000 years. Whoever left those footprints in the mud of a New Mexico lake bed did not arrive through the interior of the continent. They came by another way. We do not know how many people they were. We do not know where they had been the day before. We do not know what happened to their descendants. What we know is the footprint of an adult, lengthening slightly as additional weight is taken on. The absence of smaller prints at the point where the gait changes, a child being carried across wet ground at the edge of a lake that no longer exists, in the middle of an ice age, in a place that will not have another name for 23,000 years. They were here. They were real. They were people. On a morning, going somewhere. Chapter 5. The Roads Beneath the Sea. There is a map that does not appear in most textbooks, because most textbooks show the world as it currently exists. This map shows the world as it existed during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than today. The Bering Sea is gone. In its place, Beringia. The shallow waters of the continental shelves along the Pacific coast of North America are exposed as a narrow coastal plain, running from Alaska southward along the edge of the continent, at the junction between the land and the sea, which is among the most productive environments on this planet. This is the context in which the two primary theories of how the first Americans arrived have to be understood. The first theory is the one that anchored Clovis first, the ice-free corridor. As the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets began to retreat, starting around 15,000 to 16,000 years ago, a passage opened between them, running north to south through what is now Western Canada. People living in Beringia could, in principle, have followed this corridor southward into the interior of the continent. The problem is timing. Studies of ancient pollen and animal bones recovered from lake sediments along the corridor's route have shown that the ecosystem within the corridor did not become productive enough to sustain a human population until approximately 12,600 years ago. Before that, the corridor existed as a geographic feature, but it was not a place where people could have survived while passing through. There was not enough food. If human beings were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they did not get there through a corridor that would not support human life for another 10,000 years. The corridor existed, but it was not the first road. The second theory has a name that captures something essential about what it proposes: the kelp highway. Kelp forests are among the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth. Dense stands of giant kelp create underwater canopies that support extraordinary concentrations of fish, shellfish, marine mammals, and seabirds. And kelp forests follow a nearly continuous band along the coastlines of the northern Pacific, from Japan, across the Aleutian Islands, and down the Pacific coast of North America, all the way to Baja California, during the last glacial maximum. This band of kelp-rich coastline would have been even more continuous than it is today. A human population moving along this coastline in watercraft would have had access to reliable food at every stage of the journey. They would not have needed to cross open ocean. They would not have needed to penetrate the interior of a continent locked under ice. They could have moved incrementally, generation by generation, following the productive coastal margin southward. The strongest evidence for this route is also its most frustrating feature. Almost all of it is underwater. The coastal sites where people during the last glacial maximum would have camped and built their fires are now sitting beneath 100 to 150 feet of ocean. The technology to excavate at those depths, systematically and at the scale required, does not currently exist. This means the absence of direct evidence for coastal migration is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of submergence. What we have instead are indirect signals. Monteverde, in southern Chile, is the most powerful of them, a site at the far southern end of the continent, 14,500 years old, with evidence of marine resources including seaweed gathered from the coast. If people were at the southern tip of South America 14,500 years ago using coastal resources, the most direct explanation is that their ancestors moved down the Pacific coast. The honest answer to the question of how the first Americans arrived is that we do not know with certainty, and that the evidence we would need to answer definitively is sitting underwater. We cannot currently excavate. What the evidence we do have suggests is this: the first Americans did not arrive through a single route, at a single moment, as a single founding population. They arrived through multiple pathways, over multiple generations, in a process that was gradual in the way that human expansion has almost always been gradual when examined closely. The coastal route was probably earlier, the corridor was probably later, and neither of them fully explains how long people had already been here by the time the evidence starts coming into focus. We have footprints in New Mexico from 23,000 years ago. We have a site in Chile from 14,500 years ago. We have human DNA from Oregon caves from 14,300 years ago. We have tools in Pennsylvania that may be 16,000 to 19,000 years old. From all of this, one firm conclusion: human beings were in the Americas significantly earlier than the Clovis model predicted, through routes more complex than the model accounted for. But here is the question the evidence raises and does not answer. We know they were here. We know they were here earlier than we thought, and by routes more varied than we imagined. What we have not yet asked with enough seriousness is the question that makes all of this more than an exercise in archaeological chronology. Who were these people? Not what tools did they use? Not what routes did they travel? Who were they? Chapter 6. Not data. People. There is a habit of mind that archaeological evidence encourages without meaning to. When the primary record of a human life is a stone tool, you think about the tool. When it is a layer of ash around a hearth, you think about the fire. When it is a scatter of bone fragments with cut marks, you think about the blade and the process of butchering. The evidence pulls your attention toward the object, and the person who held the tool, who built the fire, who made the cut, recedes behind the evidence they left. This is not wrong. The objects are what survived, but it produces, over time, a way of thinking about the deep human past that strips the people out of it. A trace is not a person. What follows is an attempt to reverse that habit, not by inventing what cannot be known, but by taking seriously what the evidence actually shows and following it to its human implications. 3 pieces of evidence, 3 moments, 3 windows. The first is in Texas. The Galt site sits on a limestone bluff above a spring-fed creek in Bell County. Excavations beginning in the 1990s have produced artifacts from multiple periods. The oldest dated to somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 years ago. Among the artifacts from the deepest layers are stone tools produced through a reduction sequence, a series of planned, sequential steps in which a piece of raw stone is transformed into a finished tool through a process that can involve 15 to 20 distinct actions, each one building on the result of the previous one, each one requiring the toolmaker to hold in mind not just what they are doing at this moment, but what the stone will need to look like several steps from now. This is not a simple cognitive operation. It requires planning across time, holding a future state in the mind and working backward from it to the present action, anticipating the consequences of each strike before making it. It also requires that this knowledge was transmitted. Someone taught the person who made these tools. That person was taught by someone before them. The sequence of knowledge extends backward through generations. Knowledge of this kind cannot be transmitted without language. Something that allowed one person to show another not just what to do but why. Not just the steps but the logic behind them. The tools at Galt are evidence of people thinking about the future. They are also evidence of people talking to each other about what they know. The second piece of evidence is not from a single site. It is a pattern that runs across the continent. Obsidian is a volcanic glass that fractures to produce extremely sharp edges. It was prized by human populations across the Americas for tens of thousands of years. And obsidian is geologically specific. The chemical signature of obsidian varies from one volcanic source to another in ways that allow researchers to determine with considerable precision where any given piece originated. When archaeologists map where specific obsidian sources appear in the archaeological record, the results are striking. Obsidian from the Obsidian Cliff source in what is now Yellowstone, Wyoming, appears at sites in Ohio, more than 1,500 miles away. Obsidian from sources in what is now Mexico appears at sites in what is now Illinois. Obsidian from Oregon appears across the Pacific Northwest and into the interior. This material did not move by accident. It was carried by people who knew where it came from, who existed within networks of exchange and relationship that extended across distances too large for any individual or any single group to span within a single lifetime. A network of this kind does not assemble itself. It is built, maintained, renewed across generations by people who understand that connection to groups beyond their immediate circle has value. Value in the form of access to materials their local environment does not provide. Value in the form of information about resources and conditions in regions they cannot directly observe. Value in the form of relationships that allow groups reduced by illness or disaster to reconstitute themselves by drawing on connections to other groups. The obsidian networks of prehistoric North America are evidence of people who thought beyond the immediate, who invested in relationships across thousands of miles, who maintained, across generations, a web of human connection that made any individual group more resilient than it could have been alone. The third piece of evidence is from an island off the coast of California. Santa Rosa Island sits in the Santa Barbara Channel, about 26 miles from the mainland. During the last glacial maximum, it was closer to shore, but still separated from the mainland by open water. Getting there required watercraft. There was no land connection. In 1959, the bones of a human being were found eroding from a bank on the island. The remains, known as Arlington Springs, were eventually dated to approximately 13,000 years ago. Among the oldest directly dated human skeletal remains found anywhere in the Americas. What matters is not the age alone. What matters is what the presence of a human being on that island implies. They had boats capable of crossing open water in the Santa Barbara Channel, which is not a calm or forgiving body of water. Navigation required to reach that island and return is not something that happens by accident. It requires knowledge of the sea, built up over time and transmitted between generations. And then there is this. The Arlington Springs individual was not abandoned on the island when they died. Their remains were found in a context suggesting intentional burial. Someone dug a place for this person. Someone chose to mark this death in a way that required effort and intention. Burial exists as an expression of something, an acknowledgement that this death matters, that this body deserves treatment different from an object, that something persists in the thinking of those left behind. After the person is gone, what that something was, in the belief system of the people who buried the Arlington Springs individual, We cannot know. But the act itself is recoverable. Someone buried this person. Someone stood over the ground in which they had placed someone they had known. On an island, 26 miles from the mainland, that they had reached in a boat, and the act of standing there meant something to them. 3 sites, 3 separate moments, thousands of years apart, thousands of miles apart, people who planned across time, people who maintained relationships across vast distances because they understood that connection has value no individual can generate alone, people who crossed open water deliberately, who transmitted knowledge across generations, who marked the deaths of those they knew with acts that acknowledged the significance of a specific human life. Look at what they actually did. Look at what the evidence actually shows, and then decide whether the word primitive describes the evidence or describes our reluctance to see it clearly. Chapter 7. What DNA knows and what it does. In the early 1990s, a researcher named Douglas Wallace and his colleagues published a series of studies examining the mitochondrial DNA of indigenous populations from across the Americas. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. It accumulates mutations at a relatively predictable rate, which allows researchers to estimate how long ago 2 populations shared a common ancestor. What Wallace and his colleagues found was that the mitochondrial DNA of indigenous American populations fell into a small number of distinct lineages, labeled haplogroups A, B, C, and D. All 4 were found in populations of East Asian and Siberian origin. None were common in European or African populations. The implication was clear. The ancestors of indigenous Americans came from northeastern Asia, and they came through Beringia. This finding has held up across 30 years of increasingly sophisticated genetic analysis. The basic conclusion is not seriously disputed. What has changed dramatically is the picture of how that founding migration happened. The tools that made a more complex picture possible were advances in ancient DNA analysis, the ability to extract and sequence genetic material from the bones of people who died thousands of years ago, and the development of whole genome sequencing that allows researchers to examine not just mitochondrial DNA, but the entire genetic makeup of ancient individuals. What the ancient DNA studies showed was that the founding of the Americas was not a single event. The genetic evidence supports at least 2, and possibly 3, distinct waves of migration from Asia into the Americas. The first and largest wave accounts for the ancestry of the majority of indigenous American populations. The ancient DNA evidence suggests this lineage diverged from its Asian source population somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 years ago. Consistent with the White Sands footprints, consistent with the other pre-Clovis sites, the second wave is associated with the Na-Dene-speaking populations of northwestern North America, including the Athabascan peoples of Alaska and Canada, and their linguistic relatives, the Apache and Navajo of the American Southwest. The genetic evidence suggests the Na-Dene founding population was distinct from the first wave and represents a separate migration event. A potential third wave is associated with the Eskimo Aleut populations of the Arctic, whose genetic and linguistic distinctiveness from other indigenous groups has long been recognized. One additional genetic lineage deserves mention, not because it changes the overall picture, but because it illustrates how complex that picture actually is. Haplogroup X is a mitochondrial lineage present in some indigenous American populations, particularly groups in the Great Lakes region. At low frequencies, it also appears in populations in Europe and the Middle East. This geographic distribution raised questions about whether it represents evidence of a migration from Europe rather than Asia. The current genetic evidence does not support that interpretation. When examined at the level of the full genome, rather than just the mitochondrial lineage, indigenous American ancestry shows no European component from this period. The X haplogroup in indigenous American populations is a distinct branch that diverged from its closest relatives in a region consistent with Central Asia or Siberia, not Western Europe. The most widely accepted explanation is that an ancient Central Asian population, one that no longer exists as a distinct group, carried haplogroup X. One branch of this population moved east toward the Americas. Another moved west toward Europe. Two separate migrations from a common source. Haplogroup X is not evidence of ancient contact between Europe and the Americas. It is evidence of a now vanished population ancestral to people in both places, through migrations that went in opposite directions. There is a further limitation on what DNA can tell us, and it is important to state it clearly. Ancient DNA survives best in cold, dry conditions. Bones from tropical or humid environments are far less likely to preserve extractable genetic material. This creates a systematic bias. The populations we know most about genetically are the populations who lived where DNA preserves well, the populations who lived along the coasts, in the tropical forests, in the humid lowlands, are underrepresented or absent from the genetic record, not because they were not there, because the conditions of their existence destroyed the evidence. This bias maps almost perfectly onto the geographic distribution of the evidence we are missing. We are not reading the full history. We are reading the parts of the history that happen to have been written in a medium that time has not yet destroyed. Chapter 8. Kennewick and the Battle Over Bones. Return to the Columbia River. Not to the moment of discovery, but to what the decade that followed revealed about the relationship between science, law, identity, and the question of who has the right to decide what the past means. The legal framework at the center of the Kennewick dispute was the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, signed into law in 1990. Understanding why NAGPRA exists requires understanding what preceded it. For most of the 19th century and a significant portion of the 20th, the remains of indigenous American people were collected by museums, universities, and government agencies, with little or no regard for the wishes of the communities those people belonged to. The Smithsonian Institution alone held the remains of more than 18,000 indigenous individuals at the time NAGPRA was passed. Across all American museums and universities, the total was estimated in the hundreds of thousands. These remains were held in storage, studied when researchers had interest, and otherwise treated as scientific specimens rather than as human beings who had belonged to communities that still existed and still cared about what happened to the bodies of their dead. NAGPRA was the legal response to this history. It required institutions receiving federal funding to inventory their holdings of Native American human remains, to identify the cultural affiliation of those remains, and to return them to affiliated tribes upon request. The Kennewick case put NAGPRA under a stress it had not been designed for. The question NAGPRA asks is whether human remains can be affiliated with a modern tribal nation. For remains from the recent past, this question is often answerable, but for remains 9,000 years old, from a period before the cultural traditions of the modern tribal nations had fully developed, the question of affiliation becomes genuinely difficult. The 8 archaeologists who sued the government were not primarily motivated by hostility to the tribal nations. Their argument was that the ancient one was so old that cultural affiliation, as NAGPRA defined it, could not meaningfully apply. The science of who he was had not yet been done. Returning him before that science was completed would foreclose the possibility of learning things about the deep human past that might never be recoverable from any other source. The tribal nations had a different framework entirely. For the Umatilla, the Yakama, the Nez Perce, the Wanapum, and the Colville, the question of whether the Ancient One was their ancestor was not a question to be settled by genetic analysis. Their traditions told them that their people had always been here. A 9,000-year-old man found in their territory was their ancestor. The demand that this be proven to the satisfaction of a federal court by scientific methods that their traditions did not recognize as authoritative was itself an expression of a power relationship that Nagpra had been intended to address. Both of these positions were coherent. Neither was simply wrong. They were expressions of different frameworks for understanding what ancestry means, what the past is, and who has the standing to interpret it. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the scientists. The Ancient One remained in storage. Research proceeded. And then, in 2015, the DNA spoke. A team led by researcher S.K. Villaslev extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from a small sample of the Ancient One's handbone. The results were unambiguous. The Ancient One was most closely related, among all populations studied, to the Colville people of Washington state. He was their ancestor, not metaphorically, not by tradition alone. Genetically, the legal proceedings that had kept him from his people for nearly 2 decades had been asking, in the language of federal law, a question that science had finally answered in the language of genetics. And the answer was the answer the tribal nations had given from the beginning. He was returned. He was reburied in a location the tribal nations chose and did not disclose. The Kennewick case did not resolve the underlying tensions between scientific practice and indigenous rights. It illustrated them. It showed, with a clarity that the abstractions of policy debate rarely achieve, what happens when a legal framework designed to address historical injustice encounters a scientific community that believes the past belongs to everyone, and a community of living people who believe the past belongs to them. There is no clean resolution to offer here. What the Kennewick case established, beyond any dispute, is that the story of the first Americans is not only a scientific story. It is a story about who controls the narrative of the past, and what it costs when that control is contested, and what the people who are still living owe to the people whose bones are found in rivers on summer afternoons. Chapter 9. The World They Built. From the person carrying a child across a mudflat in New Mexico 23,000 years ago to 1492. That is the span we are about to cross. Most of it is missing, not because it did not happen, because the conditions that would have preserved it were destroyed before anyone with the tools to record it systematically arrived to do so. But what survived is enough to say something important. When the ice sheets retreated and the great prey animals began to disappear, the people who had been living in the Americas for thousands of years did not simply continue doing what they had always done. They adapted, they observed, they experimented, and over thousands of years, they developed relationships with the plants and animals of the continent that would eventually transform both the human population and the landscape itself. The extinction of the megafauna forced exactly this kind of adaptation. The giant prey animals were gone. The hunting strategies that had worked for the first generations needed to change. And they did change, in ways that varied enormously across the continent, producing the extraordinary diversity of cultures and social organizations that characterized indigenous North America by the time European contact occurred. In the Great Plains, cultures developed around the hunting of bison, the one large herd animal that survived the end Pleistocene extinctions in significant numbers. The relationship between plains, peoples, and the bison was not simply predator and prey. It was a managed relationship, maintained over thousands of years through practices of selective hunting and controlled burning of grasslands. An intimate knowledge of bison behavior and ecology built up across generations and transmitted through the same networks that had once moved obsidian across the continent. In the eastern woodlands, the domestication of plants was an independent development, not borrowed from Mesoamerica, based on local species, including sunflowers and goosefoot. The people of the eastern woodlands did not wait for agriculture to arrive from somewhere else. They invented it themselves. By 1,000 years before European contact, these developments had produced something that most Americans have never been taught to think of as part of their national history. Cahokia. Cahokia was a city located on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River near what is now St. Louis, Missouri. It supported at its peak a population estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with perhaps another 50,000 to 100,000 in the surrounding region. At the time Cahokia was at its height, London had a population of roughly 15,000 to 25,000 people. Most cities of medieval Europe were smaller than Cahokia, or comparable to it in size. The city was organized around a central plaza flanked by platform mounds. The largest, now called Monk's Mound, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, built entirely by human labor, without draft animals, without wheeled vehicles, without metal tools. The organizational capacity required to construct it does not exist without complex social and political institutions. Cahokia had those institutions. It declined. By 1350 or so, the population had decreased dramatically. By the time European explorers traveled through the region, Cahokia had been abandoned for more than a century. The people who built it had not disappeared. They had dispersed, their descendants joining and founding other communities, carrying with them what Cahokia had developed and transmitted. The city was gone. The people were not. Further south, the civilization centered on Tenochtitlan. The city the Spanish arrived at in 1519, which now lies buried under Mexico City. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the shore by causeways wide enough for 10 people to walk abreast. At the time of Spanish contact, it had a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The Spanish soldiers who first saw it were veterans of campaigns across Europe and Africa. They wrote home to say they had never seen anything like it, that the markets were larger than any market in Spain, that the city was more orderly, more impressive than any European city they had ever entered. Hernán Cortés, in his letters to the Spanish crown, described Tenochtitlan in terms of amazement he clearly struggled to contain. He had expected something primitive. He found something that challenged his entire understanding of what civilization could look like. All of this, from the footprints at White Sands to the causeways of Tenochtitlan, is one continuous story, not a story of primitives slowly becoming civilized. A story of human beings, descended from the people who first crossed into this continent by routes we are still working to understand, building on what they inherited and what they figured out across thousands of years, in response to the specific conditions of the specific places they inhabited. By 1492, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. They spoke more than 1,000 distinct languages. They practiced agriculture, fishing, hunting, and gathering. They built cities, maintained road systems, conducted long-distance trade, and organized themselves into political entities ranging from small bands to large empires. They were not a single people. They were not a single culture. They were the result of 20,000 or more years of human life on a continent. In all the diversity and complexity that 20,000 years of history produces when it is allowed to develop, 1492 was the interruption. From one person carrying a child across a mudflat in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, to 50 million people speaking 1,000 languages across 2 continents in 1492. That is the span of the story we have been telling. Most of it is missing, not because it did not happen, because it was not preserved, or because it was destroyed. What we have is enough to know that the story was real, that it was vast, and that the version of it most Americans learned growing up is not wrong in the way a lie is wrong. It is wrong in the way that a single frame from a long film is wrong when it is presented as the whole story. The question is not only who was here first. The question is what we are willing to look at when we ask that question seriously. Chapter 10. What Science Cannot Decide Alone. In 2012, the Crow tribe of Montana filed a lawsuit challenging a federal decision about water rights on the Little Bighorn River. The case turned, in part, on questions about the historical presence of the Crow people in the region, how long they had been there, what their relationship to the land had been across generations, and what legal weight that relationship carried in the present day. The scientific evidence in cases like this, archaeological surveys, genetic data, radiocarbon dates, is not politically neutral. It is evidence in ongoing disputes about who has claims to what, and the communities who are the subjects of that evidence have not always been consulted in its production. This is the context in which the relationship between science and indigenous knowledge about the past has to be understood. Many indigenous communities across the Americas hold origin traditions that say their people have always been here. Not that their ancestors migrated from somewhere else 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, that they emerged from this land, or were placed here by forces that science does not study, or have existed on this continent since before time was measured in the way that science measures it. These traditions are not ignorant of modern genetics and archaeology. Many indigenous scholars and community members are thoroughly familiar with the scientific literature. The conflict is not between scientific knowledge and ignorance of it. It is between 2 different frameworks for understanding what questions about the past are worth asking, and what kinds of answers count as answers. Science asks what the physical evidence tells us about where human beings came from and how they got here. It answers in the language of genomes and radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic sequences. Indigenous origin traditions ask something different. Who are we? And what is our relationship to this land? And what does that relationship mean for how we live and what we owe to each other and to the world we inhabit? These are not 2 ways of answering the same question. They are 2 different questions. And the fact that the answers sometimes conflict does not mean one of them is simply wrong. It means they are operating in different registers, asking about different things. This matters practically because the story of the first Americans is not an abstract historical question for the people whose ancestors are its subject. It is a question with direct consequences for land rights, for sovereignty, for the legal and political status of indigenous nations in the present day. The people who are the subjects of that evidence have not always been consulted in its production. The history of American archaeology includes a long period during which non-indigenous researchers studied indigenous remains and sites and produced knowledge about indigenous history that was then used in contexts over which indigenous communities had no control. That is changing. Unevenly, imperfectly, but changing. A more complete account of the first Americans has to include an honest acknowledgement of who has been doing the accounting, in whose interests the knowledge has been produced and used, and what has been lost or distorted in the process. The silence that surrounds much of what we do not know is not a natural silence. It is partly the silence of evidence destroyed, partly the silence of questions not asked, because the people who might have asked them were not in the rooms where questions were being formulated, and partly the silence of knowledge that exists in forms that academic research has not always known how to hear. Chapter 11. What we still do not know. As of the time this is being written, here is what the weight of evidence most strongly supports. Human beings were present in the Americas at least 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, based on the White Sands footprints and the multiple independent dating methods applied to them. The current evidence strongly suggests this date. It does not rule out an earlier one. The founding population descended from people of East Asian and Siberian ancestry who crossed into the continent through Beringia. The number of distinct migration events and their precise timing remains a matter of active research, with the evidence currently supporting at least 2 and possibly 3 or more distinct waves. The route or routes by which people arrived remain uncertain. The coastal route along the Pacific margin is supported by indirect evidence and is consistent with the timing of pre-Clovis sites. The ice-free corridor was a later development, possibly used by subsequent populations. Now here is what we do not know. We do not know the maximum age of human presence in the Americas. The current confirmed minimum is 21,000 to 23,000 years. The actual age of first arrival may be older. The evidence to answer this question is most likely sitting in locations we cannot currently access. We do not know the full genetic history of the founding populations. The ancient DNA record is systematically biased toward cold, dry environments. The coastal populations, who may have been among the earliest arrivals, are almost entirely absent from the genetic record. Not because they were not there, but because the conditions of their existence did not favor the preservation of their DNA. We do not know what proportion of the pre-contact cultural knowledge of indigenous America has been lost. We know that the demographic catastrophe of the post-contact period destroyed knowledge as well as people. Somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century and a half following European contact. The languages that are gone took with them knowledge systems that had no existence outside the people who spoke them. We are working with what remains. And what remains is extraordinary, and also deeply incomplete, in ways that the incompleteness of the archaeological record does not fully account for. The gaps in what we know are not random. They are shaped by the history of who has done the looking, what they have been looking for, and where they have been able to look. A more complete picture will require not just more data, but different questions, asked by different people, in collaboration with the communities whose history is being studied. That shift is happening, unevenly and imperfectly, but the direction is clear. The story of the first Americans is not finished. Every decade of research produces findings that require the previous decade's conclusions to be revised. The revisions do not make the story less true. They make it more true, in the way that a more detailed map is more true than a less detailed map, even though the more detailed map also reveals, at its edges, more territory that has not yet been mapped. There is a coastline that no living person has ever seen. It ran along the western edge of the Americas during the last glacial maximum. At the margin, where the land met the sea, when the sea was 300 to 400 feet lower than it is today, parts of it were gentle, flat beaches giving way to low coastal plains, river mouths opening into calm estuaries, kelp forests beginning just offshore, dense and full of movement. People lived there. We know this, not because we have found the evidence, but because we understand the conditions. Fresh water from rivers, protein from the sea, shelter from coastal landforms. The kind of place where people stop moving and start staying. They built fires and made tools and buried their dead and told each other things that mattered and taught their children what they knew. And the sea, rising slowly across thousands of years as the ice melted, covered all of it. The fires, the tools, the graves, everything. It is all down there, under more than 100 feet of Pacific Ocean, along a coastline that is now the edge of the continental shelf, in water too deep for conventional archaeology to reach. What we have found, by accident or by the persistence of conditions the sea could not reach. The footprints at White Sands survived because they were inland, in a dry lake bed, in a desert. The tools at Meadowcroft survived because they were in a rock shelter. The DNA at Paisley Caves survived because the cave was dry. Survival was not the plan. Survival was the accident of specific conditions in specific places. And yet, even with all its gaps, what the record shows is enough. They crossed into an empty continent. They moved through it and adapted to it and learned it in the way that you learn something when your life depends on knowing it well. They found the places where food was reliable and water was permanent. And they stayed. They taught what they knew. The reduction sequences for the stone tools, the routes through the kelp forest, the behavior of the bison herds and the salmon runs, and the patterns of drought that required adjustments that only memory could guide. All of it transmitted, person to person, generation to generation, through language and demonstration, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that no individual could have assembled alone, but that a community, across time, could build and pass forward. They built things over thousands of years. The descendants of the first arrivals built settlements and trade networks and cities and agricultural systems and writing and astronomy and political institutions of a complexity that most Americans have never been taught to associate with the pre-contact Americas. The footprints at White Sands are 23,000 years old. The communities descended from the people who made them are still here. The thread from that morning to this one has never been cut. We are looking at a history that is mostly underwater, mostly lost, mostly beyond recovery. And still, what has survived is enough to know that something extraordinary happened here. That the first chapter of American history is not 1492 or 1352 or even 13,000 years ago. It is a morning 23,000 years ago, when the ground was wet and someone picked up a child and kept walking. The archive is not closed. It is mostly underwater, and we are only beginning to learn how to read it.